Okie dokie. So, this is part of our unit on water pollution. We're going to talk about the impacts that we as humans have on wetlands as well as mangroves. So, these would be anthropogenic. I throw that word at y'all a lot because you need to remember what it is. Anthropogenic meaning caused by humans. So, where are wetlands and mangrove forests? Well, mangrove forests are going to be coastal. So, anywhere you see this pink line on this map, so these coastal areas, that's going to be mangrove forests. Notice they're in tropical and subtropical areas. So, you're not going to find them up, say, in Canada. You're going to find them here in like around the Caribbean, here in tropical and subtropical Africa. A lot of mangrove forests are in Indonesia, some around Australia, and then wetlands tend to be found where you have river systems, sometimes lake systems, and these are areas that are going to be kind of waterlogged. So your soil is going to be covered part or all of the time with water. Some other names for wetlands are marsh, swamp, bog, fen. Mangrove forests also have another characteristic that the plants here have to be tolerant of salt because it's an intertidal ecosystem and it's usually where ocean meets land. So mangroves are especially special because they can tolerate high levels of salt, whereas a lot of plants cannot. And so these mangroves grow in an area where you would otherwise not necessarily have thriving ecosystems. So, a reminder, why are wetlands important? Well, one thing they do is they naturally purify water. Another thing they do is they protect against floods. So, let's say a lot of rain comes in and you get like a lot of rain, just huge rainstorms. Well, what happens is when water hits that wetland, it's going to kind of, some of it gets absorbed in the soil. Wetlands tend to be larger, spread out, and so the speed of water decreases there. And so water will kind of get caught in the wetlands, which can then later be slowly released. So that downstream of a wetland, you won't have as much flash flooding happening, even if there's rain systems upstream. The water purification includes filtering water as water passes through this kind of super dense plant matter and soil. It's going to filter out some of the impurities and things like that. And it's also going to provide habitat for a lot of organisms. There are a lot of species of birds, for example, that will lay their eggs and raise their young in wetlands as part of their like yearly migration. You have a lot of organisms that will live in these areas. Wetlands are kind of biodiversity hotspots. Mangrove forests are especially important as well because they can do a lot of things. One thing they do is they stabilize the coastline. So they help make sure that like you don't have as much erosion so that you don't lose more land. They reduce erosion. They also reduce some of the intensity of some storms. So they protect against, storm surges, which is way like increases in the water level as a storm is approaching, waves or tidal systems. And they have these really complicated branching root systems, kind of like what you see here, that provide food and shelter for a lot of organisms from predators. So let's look at this diagram. Like, for example, they protect the coastline better than things like breakwaters, or if you've ever been to Galveston and seen their seawall, mangrove forest would do as well, if not better. They can also filter water, so they are important to help maintain water quality. Then they are also going to be fisheries, so a lot of fish species will live there. And another important thing, they are carbon sinks. So they absorb carbon and then they keep it in their like super complicated root systems, which can then end up releasing carbon into the soil so that it's not going to go into the air instead. Unfortunately, with a lot of mangroves being cleared, none of these ecosystem services are going to happen in those areas. So, what are the threats to wetlands and mangrove forests? Well, one big threat, especially for wetlands, is dam construction. So, when you build a dam, one of the kind of pros that's touted for them is that they control flooding and they make sure there's a constant flow of water. But ecosystems didn't evolve and develop under those characteristics, wetlands often depend on seasonal flooding. So when you don't have that seasonal flooding, you actually will see the wetlands shrinking some. Another thing is dams reduce the flow of water downstream. So let's say you have this one river. You build a dam here. Okay, that's going to, store some water. Well, that's going to reduce the amount of water that flows downstream. You build another dam. Okay, so you'll back up some river water in a reservoir, and now you have even less water flowing downstream. And what that does is that decreases flow. Another thing, when you have some place that stops water, all the sediment comes out of solution. So anything it was carrying, dirt particles, etc., will fall to the bottom of those reservoirs. In fact, periodically you have to dredge or kind of drag along the bottom of those reservoirs to remove the sediment that builds up. Unfortunately, with less sediment, that's going to change the characteristics of the river downstream because water erodes. Water cuts channels through things. And if you don't have sediment deposited, you'll have deepening rivers, which can then alter river geography. There's some complicated stuff that can happen with rivers, changing the channels through which water flows, and that can also impact wetlands downstream. So, my big example is the Colorado River system, which is in the western United States. A lot of that water has been dammed up and diverted for irrigation to let people grow crops, etc., in what is otherwise a desert environment. Before any dams were constructed on it, there was one of the world's largest desert estuary. An estuary, if you remember, is where fresh water meets ocean water. There were almost 8,000 square kilometers of wetlands. But once all these dams were built on the Colorado River, what you ended up having is these wetlands just dried up. So these wetlands were providing feeding and nesting ground for birds. They were spawning habitats for fish so they could release their eggs and sperm and reproduce. They were habitats for some marine mammals. And most years, the Colorado River does not reach the ocean because so much of it's been diverted. So those wetlands, a lot of them are gone. Commercial development can also be a big issue. So what you're seeing in this diagram is you're seeing the greater Houston area. So the city of Houston is like here, here's Galveston, and here's the Gulf of Mexico. This is showing kind of the health of wetlands. So you'll see if it's this light blue color, it's in excellent health. If it's in this orange color, it's like critically damaged. And this was back in like 2016. Notice that around Houston proper, those wetlands are critically damaged. And then in the outlying area, there are wetlands that require action to try and save them. Well, wetlands a lot of times are filled in. Like, hey, this is just a bunch of marsh or swamp. Let's fill it in so we can build some homes or businesses. Or they're drained of extra water so that, oh, if we got dry land, we can build stuff there. Or occasionally they're even flooded so they can create lakes that people can go swimming in, fishing, etc. When you don't have these wetlands, though, you see impacts on the surrounding areas. So I forget the name of the particular hurricane. One of the hurricanes that really negatively impacted Houston. The prevailing theory is that some of the negative impacts of that hurricane could have been decreased if you had had wetlands in place, if you had had actual functioning wetlands. So a lot of wetlands in the area were paved over, were filled in, so that way the city of Houston could expand. And without those wetlands, had greater impacts from natural disasters. Another thing, mangrove forests are often cleared for aquaculture or for coastal development. People are like, oh, I want to live on the beach. I want to have oceanfront property. I don't want to have all these trees in the way, blocking my view or getting in the way of me getting to the ocean. Or these areas are really good for raising shrimp. And so in some areas, they'll clear mangrove forests, raise shrimp there. Unfortunately, they don't do it sustainably. So then they got to go clear more mangrove forests so that way they can raise more shrimp. And you're just ending up always destroying mangrove forests. Overfishing causes problems in any body of water, depletes resources. It can lead to all these adaptations in organisms that we've talked about before. If you overfish, then the ones that are left are going to be smaller because you fished all the big ones. And that can really disrupt the ecosystem and make an ecosystem very vulnerable to invasive species, which can then cause even more harm. Mangroves, since those forests are a lot of shelter from predators, if you overfish there, that's going to do a lot of damage to the local food chains. And then another thing, a lot of aquaculture that happens near mangrove forests is not done sustainably. So it's going to release a lot of chemicals like waste and antibiotics into the area, which is going to pollute the local area and can damage the ecosystems as well as the forests themselves. Then there are pollutants that are coming in. So wetlands have water flowing through them. They're part of a river system. So any pollutants that are carried with that are going to flow into the wetland. If these are toxic, that's a big problem because they can accumulate or build up in the sediments or the dirt of the wetlands, especially since the wetlands are filtering out some of these pollutants. Mangrove forests are really sensitive to herbicides and various pollutants. So there are a lot of mangrove forests that, you subject them to small amounts of pollutants, it could damage them or even kill mangrove forests. Then, if you have oil spills in an ocean, those oil spills can cause oil to cover the roots of these plants, which limits the transport of oxygen. They need to take in oxygen, some of it through their roots, since their roots are kind of underwater a lot of the time, depending on the tides. Then there's marine debris, including plastic. There's a lot of plastic in the ocean, and that can cause a number of different impacts. So these plastic layers can smother some of the trees. They can cause the death of animals, especially if animals eat those plastics. So there are a lot of negative impacts from pollutants as well. So that is that. Go watch a video of some puppies or something to make sure you're not super depressed after that.